All right, today we are looking at editing in film and how that impacts how we perceive the film, different considerations for editing, and all of that. So, in order to look at the how it gets to where we are today, which is very different from how it started. Of course, first you've got to look at early editing, and well, really, what is the lack of editing in that process? Because if you look at the very, very beginning, right? If we look at the very start of stuff, you have the first films. Actually, let me just do it like this here. Were composed of a single load of in the camera, so they didn't have a lot of space, right? We were looking at initially seconds to, when it moved up to minutes, that was a big deal. So you didn't have really a chance to edit anything because it was so short for that, right? So they would take a quick shot. It would be a single setup for that one shot, and that's really because you only have a single load in the camera. You got one shot. And the load is a continuous length of exposed film stock. But basically what it just means is, we could put it like this, is that you basically got one single shot. So you set it up ahead of time, and it was too small or too short, I guess, to have any kind of editing that would make sense. Too short for editing. They also, we already looked at, like kind of the purpose and early kind of structure of what was going on. And the reality is that it really wasn't about editing anyways. They were just trying to showcase daily life and these quick little snippets of scenes from people doing things with, walking out of the factory, sitting down and having some food, playing a game, watering a garden, the train showing up. So you don't have, there wasn't really a purpose for editing with such a short amount, and the fact that, of course, the content was based on showing these scenes and having them be as realistic as possible. And if you're being as realistic as possible, then you aren't going to do a bunch of cuts. Even if it was longer, let's say, like if they're trying to show realism and this is what life is like, let's observe, well, then it doesn't make sense to edit it initially. Now, of course, as it gets longer, it only takes within a few years, editing has become a fundamental part of filming. So it doesn't take long. As soon as it starts getting longer, then you have it become a central aspect. So we'll say within a couple years, editing had become central, we'll say a central element of film. And the reason for this, of course, was that it got longer and people began experimenting with things outside of these snippets of daily life. Well, then you're going to want to create a narrative. And it really is one of the important parts that within that, and you could say even with daily life, there's going to be edits in things like documentaries today, right? If people aren't shooting documentaries and not having any edits, because it's a powerful component of creating tension or anxiety or excitement or nervousness or whatever. Editing can do a lot of that if you were just watching the shot straight through, that wouldn't create those type of emotions. So it's not that, the daily life documentaries, are still not cutting or editing in any way, but the narrative form really propelled the emphasis on editing because there was a specific story to tell. And because there was a specific story to tell, then they wanted to, the director, the filmmaker wanted to share that story in a way that not only got their message across, but they had to do it within the constraints of, we could put that here, so the narrative form played a role in that. But besides the narrative component, it was the limits on time still, right? You had much longer, right? You had to pick and choose what you showed. And if you're trying to get your point across and your narrative and your story, well, then you're going to edit scenes that can do that. And so we're going to look at some of those techniques, whether that's parallel editing, cross jumping, the jump cut. There are the various aspects that can maintain the continuity of the story without having to show like every single aspect of it. Now, in early editing, even as it became essential, right, this was done with the camera. So early editing was not done with messing with the film itself, but was actually just done with a camera. And I feel like this is something that back before smartphones, when the personal camcorders became popular, but you don't have smartphones yet. Every kid at some point when they got a chance to play with a camcorder, that's how they edited the first time, which is this way, which was you simply shut off the camera, right? So you'd film a scene and then you would shut off the camera, because early editing, and you could argue early editing is a loose term. I would argue everything until digital is difficult editing. So a novice kid that's just filming for fun isn't going to know how to edit anything with any skill. And even when there was early digital, or not, a mix between digital, when you could do computer editing, let's say, it's not digital yet, but when you could do computer editing, the reality was that most people didn't have the technology, the programs that you needed to do it. So you would take a shot, then you would pause. You don't. The early ones you had to turn off the camera, and the camcorder ones I'm talking about, which you go like into the 90s, you paused. But the same function, turn off the camera or pause the camera, it's doing the same thing. And then you would reset the scene, right, that you wanted to do for the next edit. And then you would turn the camera back on. And again, if it was in the 90s, it was pause, set scene, and then hit record again. So interesting that you're like if we're looking at the late 1800s, early 1900s, that this technique was being used, and that this technique was still being used by amateurs all the way through the 1990s. Now, granted, the professional filmmakers were not using this technique anymore, but it shows how far it's come, because we have now with smartphones that you don't have to do that anymore. You can know very little and do a lot of complex editing today because of the digital format. So there is this massive leap in what I would argue the limitations of editing that existed through most of film history, to where we are today, where there are not very many limitations. Maybe how much CGI an average person could add to it, but the apps allow you even to add that almost seamlessly. Of course, you're not going to recreate, entire worlds with a lack of knowledge in how to do so. But special effects, adding in a little bit of CGI, super, super easy with literally a touch of the button. They've got these pre-programmed sets that you can select to add to your film. So it really opens up a whole new world of editing when you shift to that digital format. But I think it's interesting to look at that connection of saying, well, in the 1900s, they were turning off the camera. And in the 1990s, anyone who didn't have any major skill in that area or the right programs and computers was also using that with the pause button. Now, from this, what it moves to is the table kind of top editing. Of where you specifically had editing tables that were designed. And this is where you get the kind of cut, where we say when editing that they're making cuts. Obviously, no one's making cuts today with actual film. But back with this development of editing, that's exactly what you were doing. Essentially, you had strips of film after it was filmed, and you would place it on the table, and the tables get more elaborate as time went on, and so there was essentially a viewing port for the film, and this would allow you to see the frame by frame shots. I mean, you could see if you hold it up to the light, but the viewing port magnified it, and it was way easier on the eyes, as well as being able to do more with detail as soon as you have these tables versus just holding it up to the light and making cuts. And then you would physically cut the film where you wanted to make an edit. And then you would find the other part that you wanted to have it, like, so let's say it was it will totally depended. So let's say you wanted to fade out, right? You didn't want it to be a jump cut where it just went from one thing to the next. Let's say you wanted to fade out. Well, they had specific, you could do blank film. They had specific film where they'd color in like a few blank frames, and they would physically color it in, and then get lighter and lighter and lighter until it was attached to the next scene. And so this was, you physically cut the film and then you physically taped it back together. And depending on what you were doing, right, whether that was adding like a fading, whether that was just adding two scenes together, whether that was cutting out an error where you filmed it, there was a mistake, and then you filmed from that where they made the mistake, and from there, and so you spliced it back together, and that's what they call it. They spliced it back together, and then you had your editing, and this is why it's still today known as a cut. But why it got that name was because they used to physically cut the film. But it's crazy to look at like early techniques with editing and how they, like I said, they had these different things that were literally colored and marked up on the film, on the frame itself, on the film, to have transitions, to have some special effects, where the special effects were, if you didn't, why people preferred to make special effects with like the mise-en-scene, and with mise-en-scene you had the design, the set design, and all of that. And so if you could make the special effects in person, that was better than trying to do it on the film itself, because it almost never looked more realistic than having a prop made that created some special effects that you used. Nonetheless, you could, if you were trying to recreate stuff, you might have a prop that then you add a few marks on the film. Let's say with like a laser, you could draw in the laser part onto the film itself. And that would be part of that editing as well. And then, like I said, they had different types of fade-ins and dissolves and transitions that you could either make yourself or purchase and tape in between different scenes as you wanted to transition to a different scene. But so that every film, especially as they got longer and longer, had thousands of cuts that then were put together to complete the film, and then would be reprinted without the taped together pieces. Because obviously later, if you're going and putting these in theaters, you're not going to hand cut and edit every single reel of film that's getting sent to the different theaters, right? You would have your final edit, and then that would get made into a seamless one that didn't have any physical cuts anymore. But it was a slow and arduous process that fundamentally changed the nature of film, though, when you see like the two early leaders, Edison and Lumiere brothers, when they first are doing those single shots to when they start expanding and making longer films, and that they then can bring in not only larger narratives or documentaries, but you can have multiple points. So let's put that as, I guess we can put it as 5 here, is it early editing allowed we'll say multiple points of view, right? It allowed for multiple locations, because you didn't have to, you'd film in one spot and then move to another to continue filming, and then you would piece that together, right? It allowed for transitions and different angles as just some of the basic things that you couldn't have before. Like even the arrival of the train, right? We only get that one angle. The camera was fixed. It gets set up. It's a clever angle to create the appearance that the train's coming at you, but it's that one single angle. And then once you can edit, you can film the train at one angle, and then you could film it at a different angle, and then maybe a third angle, and then you could edit and cut that together to have a more broader context or view of the arrival of the train, or create a longer story in between where maybe the train's arriving, then it cuts to people talking. That's part of the story, the narrative. Then it cuts back to the train, then it cuts back to the people waiting on the platform, and we're hearing their story, and then finally back to the train, right? Well, you can't do that when the arrival of a train was first filmed. It was, here's the camera, here's the shot, and that's it. Versus what the possibilities it opens up in terms of being able to tell a narrative and what you can actually include in film. And so we see this transition first with Edison and the Lumiere brothers, and then of course other people that come in after the fact. We'll look at some pictures here, and then we'll come back to what is editing. And I mean, we've kind of addressed that already. But we will look at it some more here. So early film, right? This is what the earliest was without, when there weren't even full-fledged tables. You have to have light, and you'd hold up and you can kind of see it here, right? Just ever so brief. It's very small. I mean, so imagine straining to, that's why his hair is like this. Imagine straining to get the picture and idea of the story in the film by only having to look, by holding it up to the light and then cutting where you think it is. But it would be, sometimes it was hard to tell when you're just looking at the negative, essentially, like of a picture. If you, old film cameras, when the film was developed, you got the negatives. Well, you could kind of see them. But this had its limitations as well, as long as just super, super long and tedious. Things do improve. Here you can see the viewer, and you can actually see the frame that she's actually looking at, and then holding the film that it's being fed through here. You have the one single frame, which is tiny, magnified here, and then when it's done, it's getting rolled back up. And this created more ease in editing because you weren't straining. This was a big development because it allowed for one, easier access to viewing the frames. It also created less strain. It also prevented, there were a lot of missed things in the editing before you had the kind of projectors, essentially, or magnifying viewing stations that allowed you to see more detail, because you really were going off of this tiny frame on the film reel, trying to make sure you cut at the right place, trying to make sure you when you spliced it together and cut the other piece and taped it together, that you taped it just right. Here you could vary in much more detail, see the scene, see the details in that shot, and then edit accordingly. And it just got more complicated from there. So here you can see a more modern table later that is going to have locations for multiple film reels. So you'd load them in here. It would go through these little feeders and then get wound back up again into that. And usually one of these would be the final reel. So the idea was you'd have multiple reels you'd shot of different scenes in different locations. This could go through, notice the much larger viewing station where you could actually have 2 frames seen side by side, which allowed you not only to line it up better, but also allowed you to get 2 frames instead of just a single frame view of what you were doing. You could then cut and tape back together and have from multiple reels, they would roll up the other reels, right? And then you could have the final one that was all edited together. This made it much easier. Again, this is still super time consuming. Like, it's just crazy to think about now with what we have access to with digital, how time consuming, how crazy complicated film editing was for most of the history of film. The majority of time has been this type of setup, not the digital access that we have today. Obviously, as time continues to go by, digital will surpass it. Maybe they'll have a new, like a virtual 3D interactive virtual reality editing. That would be cool. So you're like in the film, being able to edit it in virtual reality. I bet that would be cool. That might be a next step. So at some point, I'm sure we'll have something else where we're like looking at and going, oh my gosh, digital was so time consuming. Because even with the benefits of digital, it still takes a long time to edit. If you try to edit, if let's say a 3-minute clip, let's say you're making a 3-minute promo or commercial, it takes hours and hours to properly properly edit and do a good job editing a 3-minute thing. So a feature-length film, that's much, much longer. And hours and hours, and depending on how complex you're getting, it could take days. And that's with digital, where you're not having to follow linear structure, right? This requires a linear structure where you're looking at shots frame by frame as it goes through in a linear fashion. And then you're editing in a linear fashion by cutting a piece, right? And cutting maybe a piece here and then attaching that next piece right here, but it's still maintaining in this kind of linear fashion versus digital editing where you can have multiple things, and you can put something here, you can put something here, you can put something here, you can add an audio file here, and then you slowly piece it together. It doesn't have to be done in a linear fashion. I mean, the end result is it should be linear if you're having any kind of cohesive story, but you're not having to edit it in a linear fashion. In fact, you could start all the way at the end and play around. You could jump around. It doesn't matter because it's a digital format. So, I mean, you think about virtual reality might open up a new possibility in how you look at editing, or something else that they do, holographic editing. I don't know. So many things. But anyways, the point being that early editing a film was extremely tedious, super impressive what they were able to do, and incredibly time consuming. Even when you get to this stage here where you have these complex tables, and they made even more complex tables than this, where you would have multiple, basically editors that'd be doing certain scenes because it was the only way you were going to get a film done in a reasonable amount of time. And it still had its limitations because it was what you could physically do with physical film, versus is moving to a digital world where there's no physical component to it, and the computers, the applications allow you to manipulate, change, adapt, lengthen, shorten, add effects, and whatever else, audio, things like that, all within this space that doesn't have to remain linear because of the non-physical nature of it. So pretty cool. It was a massive jump, essentially. Think of it that way, is that the shift to digital, the digital was one of the most significant changes in filmmaking ever, outside of the early development of film, I think, in terms of what it allowed to do. And it created a massive jump forward in what could be done with film in the process as well. So what is editing then? What does it mean? And we obviously talked about some of what it means and creation and things like that. But if we're looking in more of a technical term with that, it is the selection and arrangement of shots and sounds, right? You are looking at a bunch of shots and sounds, and you are arranging them in a way, however that may be, that you want to tell the story, right? The final piece is the creation of how you want your story to be seen. So film editors specifically, right, they have a specific job. It is to obviously move the shots around and place in the sound, although that's sound engineering, but where that stuff's going to go. But film editors are, you have the director, you have the different positions of like that create the idea of what they want when they're shooting the film, and they work with the editors obviously as well. But the film editor's job is essentially to determine what you see. Let's put what you see, and I'll separate them out here. How long you see it, right? Is it a short cut? Is it a long cut, right? How long are we going to see each, kind of scene? The order we see things in the film, right? They're going to determine, again, it's not just the editor isn't just going rogue and doing their own thing and being like, I'm just going to make it, I think this, we're just going to do this. That's obviously, it's been discussed and storyboarded out, worked out ahead of time. But how they end up doing the stuff, right, is going to determine that. And ultimately, these things, I would say, is how the film is interpreted, right? Ultimately, a film looks very different when it's shot to once it's finalized in editing. Even actors, right? They don't get the full sense of what the movie is until they actually see it all put together, because they're filming these different scenes and they're not often in order. And then it's getting all rearranged and put together as a final editing and stuff like that. One of the other things with film editing, it's not always the case, but a lot of film editing is meant to be unnoticed, right? The goal is not for you to be like, oh, there's a cut. In fact, it's meant to be seamless. As much as it can. And there's several reasons for that. We'll say seamless, right? The idea that the average viewer, if they're just, watching for the sake of watching the film, that they're not going to notice the editing. And in fact, if there's intentional noticeable editing, but there's also the idea that if it's seamless, right, then it impacts the continuity of the film, and is going to draw you in, right? The idea that bad editing detracts from the story and enjoyment itself. If you obviously see an error in editing where you're like, oh, look, clearly there was a mistake, and then they reshot it, but they didn't edit it seamlessly together, so you can tell it's two different shots. So I was gonna say detracts from the story in fantasy, right? Or the world, right? The idea is that you were immersed in it. You don't think about that, but with bad editing, you can see with just people who don't know how to edit too, even in digital sometimes, because if you don't line it up, you're going to end up with the same thing in digital. So this is something that hasn't changed between physical film and digital. If you have a shot and then you mess up, so you refilm that part and then you cut that part and you put it together, if it's done well, it's seamless, and the viewer would never know that scene was two different shots or three different shots put together. But if you do it poorly, there will be the part where it jumps, which we'll get into jump cuts here, and we're going to look more at intentional jump cuts, because technically the bad editing can be a jump cut that's unintentional, where you cut it and then you're standing one way and then it jumps and you're in a different position. Well, that's a dead giveaway that it got edited and it's a different shot now. and they didn't edit it to make it look like a seamless transition from those two shots, right? Or maybe it overlaps, or you repeat a word because you didn't cut it at just the right spot. All of that then breaks that continuity and what has transported you into that structure of the film. What's interesting with this, so again, and not all editing is meant to be unseen and seamless. A lot of it is. Like, that's often the main goal of editing, is to create this continuity of story, to have it be seamless editing, so no one's even thinking about the editing. And it seems very smooth transitions that are natural and that our brain accepts as normal, even if they aren't technically, like, physically possible. Our brain fills in a lot of the detail, and we'll look at that with, like, some of the passage of time and how they show that. Like, we don't have to be shown every single scene to have our brain interpret, like, that, oh, it was day, now it was light, now it's dark, and now it's light again, and the person's still outside working. Well, the assumption is, if they're not with different clothing, that they stayed out all night working, right? Well, we don't have to be shown 12 hours of them laboring through the night to have our brains make that connection. Our brains naturally make that connection. And so you can showcase that, and you're not thinking about that being edited, which obviously it was, but our brains, because we fill in those details, we don't think of it as being editing. What's interesting is that a lot of film is done in mind with, again, this idea of trying to create this seamless nature, but they often aren't setting up the predetermined order of every single shot and duration of shot. So because with digital editing, you don't have to. You can film things all over the place and then just cut it together. And sometimes it's based on convenience. Sometimes it's based on where actors are available, or whatever else, controls where you are when you're filming. What's interesting to look at is actually a more recent film, the film 1917. And this was advertised as done in a few long shots. Or I think the other way it was advertised is the single shot. Now, that didn't mean that the entire film was done in one single shot, but that it was done in a few very long single shots and put together. What's interesting with this is, and so the idea was that, and we'll talk about it. They did do these long shots, but it definitely was the goal of the director and the editor together was to create these scenes that appeared to be these long single shots with the camera following around. The idea with this was that it created a sense of realism, and that and let's say, like, you were there, right? Like, you were following the soldiers through these fields and battlefields and dangerous scenes because of that style. And it does. It definitely has a different feel to it when you watch it. What's interesting is that it actually has way more cuts and editing than you would think, based on at least how it was promoted and what it was talking about. And the reason for this, I think it's a good point of just that even when films are touting as, like, these kind of longer shots, well, they may be longer shots than the average film, they often have a lot of editing still in them. They shot this film in a very interesting way and then edited it in a very interesting way. And it was because what they wanted it to look like was that it was all done in a few shots to create a sense of lack of editing. That was the goal. And so it took 3 months of filming, which isn't extra long, really. But what they did is it was comprised of multiple setups and reshoots, and then next day editing, which is not what usually happens, because what they would have to do is they had to decide what was going into the movie so that the next day's shooting would match up perfectly with the end of the last shot. So this is essentially created real-time editing. It's insanely impressive, even if it's not the single shot that it kind of got touted as. And not that the filmmakers were saying they did it in a single shot, but I remember reading reviews and talking about hyping up this movie, and it's a very good movie, was that it was, what made it unique were these single shots. And it's like, okay, yeah, but the way that they promoted it was different than what they actually did. But so what was crazy, right? They would film these long scenes, and they built these contraptions and cars with the mounts and everything else that could follow the actor as long as possible, which meant this is harder on the actor too. This has a whole impact on the actors, because they usually, as an actor, you may have a line or two, and then the scene is cut. It says stopped. And then you set up and you do a different one, and then you say a line or two. So you don't actually, like, we think like with plays, actors have to memorize their lines. In movies, I mean, I think that it's helpful if the actors memorize the lines, but you don't have to memorize you don't have to memorize all this stuff. You're doing seconds of shooting, and then you set up for the next thing, and then you're being directed and you do seconds of shooting. For the 1917, they were doing minutes and minutes of shooting. And that meant the actor had to keep things going. All the explosions had to go off at the right time. All the actors had to do and hit their lines at the right time. All the while the camera had to follow at the right space, at the right time. So insanely impressive. And then they would reshoot several times. So they would reshoot several times so that the idea would be that the editor would have 3 or 4 versions of this single scene. That's a long scene, and it is a very long scene for filmmaking. And then he would choose which one to use, with maybe some small tweaks and editing as needed. And then where they finished that off, then that would be the exact place that they would have set up for the next day, so that it didn't look like there was any editing from where they ended off the day before to the next day. It looked like it was a continuation of the same scene and the same shot. And that took a lot of extra work to do. If you watch this film, I just have 2 examples here with this. If you watch this film, pay attention to that though. Look at how long do the shots seem to be, where you're thinking about the camera and where is the camera and how are they editing these things together, so that what you're seeing in the film is going to look longer than it actually was, because they did such great seamless editing, and because they were doing that real-time editing in it. And also because they built all these contraptions and had the actors do much, much longer scenes. Because you can't do what they did with 1917 if it's the traditional 3-second shots. It doesn't work. You have to have the longer shots that go on for as long as possible. But if you've got an explosion, right? You have to time all of these people. In a normal film, it'd be the explosion with them falling, and reacting, and then cut. That's it. Then you set up the next scene for what happens after that, and then cut. And then the next scene, cut. Here, it was explosion, falling, getting up, continuing. The goal was the soldiers having to go get this message to people. And so they are constantly trying to keep going. I got to keep going. I get the blast wave of the explosion hits me and I fall down. I've got to get up and I got to keep going. Well, they would keep filming, and the actor and the extras would have to get up and keep going and remember if they had lines and where they were the direction they were supposed to go, versus what would have been, that was all one shot, versus in a normal film where it would have been 10 shots and cuts where you pause, set, give direction, go. And so then you had these crazy car contraptions with the cameras and gear so that they could move and adjust. Here you can see where the sound bar is, and then you have the camera, and they had so they could move and adjust and continue moving with the scene as it continued. So they had these massive, most of this was done on location because they needed large open fields and spaces to set up the scenes the way that they needed to be able to do them. Here's another one where it shows the camera catching him jumping. And I mean, this could be a normal setup just from this picture of like him doing this one scene and cutting. But again, what they would do is it already been filming. He jumps, lands on it. Now, of course, if the actor doesn't land that the way that they want, then they would shoot it again. But then he would get up and keep going, and the camera would continue following, right? So it super impressive within that system. All right, let's see what we'll do here. The functions of editing. There are 5 primary functions, and I mean, and there's arguments over how many, but the one in the book is good. It's a good list of kind of the purpose and function of editing. So the primary functions of editing. So the first is it organizes fragmented action and events. And it's fragmented because, right, it's a whole bunch of short shots. And they're all over the place, and you've got to put it all together to make a cohesive story, which is then also you have to create meaning from all of this through juxtaposition. Make sure I read this here. So all this shows is my handwriting sucks. And then create spatial relationships between shots. And this can be a couple of things. One is that it has that seamless visual between the shots, but also, again, I think it goes to the meaning of the shots, that the order and meaning and the relationships connect, especially if it's in you're cutting to a different location or setting. It's one thing when you're editing and it's all in the same location, but when you're then editing and then it's going to a different location, how do you create that spatial relationship? And then create temporal relationships between shots, right? Does it feel like time and timeline and like placement of that within that time doesn't make sense? Does it feel like you jumped to like a different, like where you're like, wait a minute, it was just during the day, how did we get to the nighttime? Right? Either you need to have the intentional aspect of that where you understand where you are in space and time, and how you got there. So you have a transition that shows that, so our brains know, but you have to make sure that happens, right? Otherwise you get really confused because you're like, we were in a different location at a different time, and now we're in a completely different location at a different time, and we have no idea how we got there. And if you're really bad at it, or I suppose you would just kind of piece these things together and it would jump around a whole lot. And there wouldn't be those seamless connections between that. And then lastly, establish and control shot duration and pace and rhythm. So the length, the pace, and the rhythm of the shot. So what we're going to look at within those, we're going to look at, let's see, this is 3, rhythm and tempo. And this, largely what we're going to look at with this is kind of the quick shots versus long shots and how that plays a role in how we view the scene. Because it does make a big difference between the two. I mean, and really what film rhythm, the idea is that it's kind of, it's an experience as this combination of speed, and how like you piece together quick shots of speed where it feels fast paced to slow pace, right? And it's weird, like sometimes editors do this where it's super fast paced and all of a sudden, bam, stops, right? But that's super jarring. And there has to be a reason for it. Otherwise, you want these flows of basically these, what's considered kind of this rhythm of speed, of how the slow to fast and, you know, back again goes, that makes sense within the context of the story. So you could look at the speed of the shots, right? Makes sense within the context of the story. Because if, let's say it's it's meant to be a sad, somber moment, and that would usually be a longer, slow-paced shot. Right, so here, we'll put this as an example, right? A sad and somber moment is going to then be a slow-paced shot, because that's going to reflect the importance of the scene. But, right, this is how it should be. Like, if you did instead fast-paced, quick cuts, you would be confused, right? This would equal confusion for the sad and somber moment, right? Like, it's like I had a funeral and it's like bam, 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 and you're like, wait, what? Why is there so much action going on? Is something happening at the funeral right now? Like, that's what you would think. That's what the fast-paced quick cuts is going to create. Is you're going to think like something major is about to happen or is happening at the funeral. And any type of feeling of a sad and somber moment goes out the window in that sense. And so that concept of rhythm applies to that transition from one image to another. We're going to put that down too here. Concept rhythm applies to the transition of one shot to another. The idea that does it ideally makes sense in that, right? And then with tempo, this is going to be, tempo is often created in editing, not in the filming, right? You plan like how you're going to do the shots to help the editor, but the actual tempo is almost always created in the editing itself, and this specifically works with the length of the shot. And you could say consequently the number of cuts, right, where you have either quick shots or long, quick or long shots, and that each one is going to create a different view of how things, like the pace, the feeling, the emotion, the structure that it goes with that. So, for example, long shots are, as I mentioned, those are often seen as, oops, it's going to be A. It slows down the pace. So these are often for more serious or important moments, right? Ones of reflection Westerns tend to have a lot of longer shots. And that's because of the idea of seen as the leisurely pace of the West, right? Or the cowboy's life. The cowboy doesn't have to be quick and fast unless he's in a duel. And then it shifts to quick shots. It also is about nature. When you see large shots in nature, where they're trying to showcase like the vastness of the size of a mountain or the fields or distance, right? A longer shot is going to highlight that versus if you have a bunch of quick cuts and quick shots of the nature. It would look funny. You're like, oh, what's going on there? Again, I think that's the difference in a lot of ways with versus quick cuts. You're going to, this is the stuff that's the fast action paced edits, right? This is going to be this kind of more dynamic, more engaging, more fast, right? The idea of it's going to speed up the tempo and create more of a massive kind of intensity. Let me put intensity. I forgot to show Jesse James for this. So we're going to look at the assassination of Jesse James. So here we'll put Jesse James example. I'm trying to think if I want to go write something on that. I was like, oh no, I left out. I have the scene in the PowerPoint and I skipped it to go to quick cut. We'll come back to the quick cut. So we'll put here, because the Jesse James example is for a long shot. So we'll put kind of D here and we'll put continuation of long shot. Because I do want to show this example and talk about it. So this is the assassination. Oops. Of Jesse James. It's a super long title by the coward Robert Ford. This is the actual title of the movie. You don't usually have extra long titles like this. There's theory on lengths of titles and like what is good and what is not. So the average take was the average length in this film was 1 minute and 40 seconds, which is extremely long in filmmaking, because if we put here, whoops, let's put, so that this is clear when I put the next one. So this is in Jesse James. Okay. I'm not going to write the whole title again, but the average length of most films is 7 seconds. Right? So that's a huge difference. So just knowing that alone, right, gives us an example of how the pace, the rhythm, the feel, the emotion of that film is going to be different than the average film, because you have these much longer shots that aren't getting edited in between. So there's not a cut, right? And versus the average length of most films is 7 seconds. And there's some that actually say the average length is 4 to 5 seconds, right? So the 7 seconds is being generous. We'll put here others. And I you know, and you could argue that it's actually probably 4 to 5 seconds is more common now. I would say that over time we have done more and more cuts, shorter time. Here, let's look at, so to give you an idea of length here. So here is these are hyper fast ones. These are not average ones. These are the fastest shot average films with the fastest average shot length, right? So in Resident Evil 2, the average shot length in the entire film was 1.64 seconds. Hot Fuzz was 1.71, Domino 1.72 seconds, Saw 2 1.74, Moulin Rouge 1.9, Die Hard 4 1.9 seconds. So this is, oh, you can't see that. This is right. This is, as it says here, well, they call it hyper fast edited films. These are like the fastest. Okay, so this is not the average of most films. These are the ones that are fast, but that's insane to think about. So when we're going to come back and talk about quick cuts in a minute, we'll look at this idea with that. But like, that's like, if you speed it up, one of the good ways to tell like how many cuts are in a film is actually speed up the film and watch it, not just at like 1.5, watch it at like 5 to 10 times, and it will visually show you. You'll start to see how many cuts there are because it's just boop, 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 back and forth. That's my that's my sound effects apparently for that. But it just jumps, bam, 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 back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And if it's longer shots, you actually sped up to there, you still might get a sense of what the story's about, even if you're not, you can't hear it, you're just visually watching it. But when you have these shorter or hyper fast cuts, if you speed it up at all, it almost becomes unintelligible. Now, again, we'll come back to quick cuts and fast-paced stuff and why you do that in a minute. These ones are extremely fast for the average length of films in general. Here are some other ones just to give you an idea. And these are, Bourne Ultimatum, average shot length was 2 seconds. Domino we already did. Resident Evil 1.7. Taken 3 1.7. Mad Max 2.1. And so it's I have the Indiana Jones out of order. That's okay. So it's crazy in terms of what we don't even think about it. Like, so that means think about it with the actors. They're filming, and now again, it doesn't mean the cuts and stuff. Sometimes like you'll film with multiple cameras, and the actual scene that they film they do in a longer set, and then they cut between the different cameras to get the shots, right? So that's often happening where you're not having an actor speak for 1 second. Hello, my name is Claire, right? That doesn't, and then you put it all together. It would be weird, right? You have a conversation. So the actors are having a scene, but you might have like 3 or 4 cameras set up, and they're shooting at different angles. So then when the editor gets it, they can cut between those different angles. If you're just, let's say you're having a conversation with someone on screen, if you have only one angle of that conversation for a 3-minute, discussion on friendship and love, let's say, people are going to get bored watching it. From even, let's say you had a more dynamic soliloquy of, I don't know, something that's super emotional, super passionate, lots the actors giving it its all. If it's still with one shot, like one angle, or like where he's talking to people, and like you usually would show the person giving this dynamic speech, and then the reaction of the people listening to that person, right? And it would go back and forth between the two. If it's just on him, the reality is we have short attention spans. People get bored with that. It takes a lot more. The actor actually has to be really good for longer scenes. I mean, that's longer scenes that are not edited and stuff. But so, like I said, it's not like the actors when these average ones are like 1.9 seconds. Are speaking only for 9 seconds, right? When it's speaking stuff that usually is shot with multiple cameras, and they have them, do longer scenes, and then they edit it to cut between different angles to give us a more dynamic view. However, when there's the action part, those are often very short. Like it literally is explosion, main character gets thrown to the ground, cut. Next scene. So you stop. Everything stops. You set up for the next one. Next one is actor on the ground, getting up and reacting to explosion. Stop. Next scene, right? So when you get into the like major action stuff, that's often filmed pretty short paces. But when it's like just discussion and things where it makes it more seamless when you just have multiple cameras that you can cut back and forth to in editing. to make it more dynamic. But it also shows the value of the editor, because you need that to create that dynamic scene. So in Jesse James here, we've got 1, 2, and 3. We'll put 1, right? So you see him going up. It's the outlaw and his sidekick, Charlie Ford, or Robert Ford, hesitating at the banks of the frozen river. And Charlie is reluctant to cross the river for fear that the ice might break. So he's sitting there contemplating, right? Here's the river and stuff. And this is all happening. I'm showing it in frames here, but this is all happening. There's not different cuts. It's a longer cut, right? So they start, and I couldn't find this single frame where they start further out. This is not the start of this cut. They actually, you see them walking up to this spot. So it actually starts before this. I just couldn't find an example of it. So this is the closest I could get to the start of this scene. Oops, sorry, that was my shoe on the ground there. But so you see him walking up to the river. So it's a long shot that showcases the landscape, the emptiness of the space, the cold, all of that. And it sees them coming in, and it's zooming in more than, like, they're not cutting to move closer. And then he moves out onto the start of the river. Right, and it's this reluctance, this slow pace, because what this does is it's a very slow scene, because we're watching them instead of cutting to where they start to walk up, and then it cuts to them partially out on the river, the frozen river. We see them pausing at the edge, and we watch it happen, and they don't cut it out. And then you see them again. It looks like it's cut here, but it's not. It's just because of the frames I'm showing. Walking onto the edge and then kind of squatting down and thinking about it, and then you do get the final cut. And actually, just before this one, obviously there was, because the camera was here and then the other camera's over here, and so they do cut to that scene here. But before it gets cut to that final, like a different angle of it, that long scene without cuts highlights his anxiety and fear of going on to the river. It's raining really hard. I don't know if you guys can hear that in the mic, but it just started raining very loudly. And so it's meant to highlight his fear of the ice might break, the fear of the frozen river. And then it's made worse by, as he's slowly making the way, or when Jesse wanders out onto the ice and then stops and asks Charlie if he's ever considered suicide, right? It's meant to showcase then him pondering that question, as well as isolate the characters in this kind of vast landscape that exists around it. That extreme long shot or a long cut, right, emphasizes the feeling of isolation, of uncertainty, of anxiety, or not anxiety in the fast-paced anxiety, but like the fear. Fear is a better word for the anxiety. Anxiety we tend to associate with fast cuts. Fear, though, where it's fear that's paralyzing, right? You really get a sense that he's slightly paralyzed by this fear that is only heightened by the question about suicide. And then that's emphasized by this single long cut that is also emphasizing the isolation of where they're at in this cold, vast landscape, and that's done by the choice of having, whether you have quick or long shots, and whether that, how much are you cutting, when do you cut, when do you break that scene? Because once you cut and you move to a different thing, you've broken that almost spell of that longer scene. And so a good editor and film director and everyone involved in the film that's setting up and designing how they want the film to be is going to know what part of the narrative, or what are we wanting with this part of the narrative to feel? What are we wanting it to create? And right, if it's editing done well, it's going to emphasize the emotion, the feelings that you want the viewer to view and feel and experience as they're watching that particular scene. It can go wrong where if you choose the wrong thing as an editor, it doesn't emphasize that. If this was a series of quick cuts of we either quickly make it to the middle, then you lose all that contemplative aspect of the fear of the water, contemplating the question of suicide, the feeling of isolation. It just goes away. Even though the shot is still like the scenery and what we're seeing is the same, because it breaks up that continuity essentially of that scene. In a different way, it creates a different meaning. So, like, again, the function and structure of the editor is extremely important within that system. All right, so what we're going to look at now is fast cuts or quick cuts. You see it called fast cuts, quick cuts, same thing. And this is more often what you see in a lot of films. Again, if the average length is somewhere between 4 to 7 seconds, depending on who you ask and when you ask it, right, or let's say be just 5 to 7 seconds. That puts it in the range there, right? Then we're, a lot of the times the scenes, we're getting all these cuts within one scene, which is visually more stimulating. One of the reasons that it creates more excitement and interest and engagement is because it's visually more stimulating than when you have something that's not changing. So this is a good one, I think, that shows Indiana Jones in this one short little scene, and I'll show it in just a second, where it has it's multiple quick cuts for a very, very short scene that you wouldn't think of normally. It's 12 cuts in a very short time frame to highlight this really one instance where he's just squaring off between this guy, right? Indiana Jones is squaring off between those two guys are squaring off, right? And the decision to pull the gun, looking at each other, decision to pull the gun, the whip, and running off is done. You think, oh, it's so short of a scene anyways, it doesn't need so many cuts. But it creates a different feel and dynamic when you have multiple cuts than if they had kept it on like this guy longer or kept it on Indiana Jones longer and didn't move back and forth, where you can highlight him beginning to pull out his weapon, highlighting him thinking about aiming, showing the background, showing Indiana Jones, then getting the whip ready, right? That it gives you also, which this could lead to where we're talking about, this isn't exactly parallel editing, but the idea that both this guy here and Indiana Jones are doing these things at the same time. So he's getting his gun out and starting to move into position. While that's happening, Indiana Jones is getting his whip out and getting ready, right? And so by moving back and forth, we get to see both of those, versus if you only saw Indiana Jones, maybe you'd show him pulling out his gun, and then the rest of the shot was just Indiana Jones getting out his whip and doing the gun. Well, you'd see it at the end of the gun was there, but that suspense of whether the gun was going to, if he was going to be faster than Indiana Jones and shoot the gun at him, it wouldn't be there. And it creates a more suspenseful, anxious moment of, is Indiana Jones going to get the best of this other guy? Is he going to be fast enough, right? And just by that simple decision of how many cuts you put in to emphasize that, creates that difference in how we would view this scene in that process. Let's see. Well, okay, I have the clip for this, so I'm going to get that up real quick, and then we will watch that. All right, so let's look at that clip here that I got up. This is the Raiders of the Lost Ark, showing that scene that we looked at the different frames with. Although this is this part shows, right, it's going to say when it starts. This is before that. Right here. That's the first one. And that's the last one. Right, so it's not a long sequence of shots, and in that very short amount of time, right, there were 12 cuts to that scene. And it's intentionally, they mention it here, right, but planning ahead, Spielberg shot only the pieces he needed to cover the scene and tell the story visually. is that like it's set up for how do you want the story to be viewed, be experienced in that process. And this is where now we're moving back to the quick cuts there, right? So let's we'll draw the other arrow down over here. There we go. A little chaotic with that, but that's okay here. So this is the quick cuts. Oops, I'm going to move this up because I have it low on the screen right now. Quick cuts continued. That way there is hopefully that it becomes clear. So right, this editing technique, just like the long shot, is pretty simple, but it's connected on the idea of shots taken from multiple camera angles, right, are put together at an accelerated pace, or we'll just say quick pace. So instead of it being the long shot, it's quick, very short sequence of shots. And the idea of this, right, is that it can create a frantic feeling. It can create I guess we'll just put this, what did I put for the, come on, let me go back up for a second here. Intensity. Okay, so it can also create I mean, it just heightens in general the emotional response, right? So that can be anxiety, excitement, creates more interest, usually engagement. It also is usually more of a positive tone. These are also very much based on action shots are, we'll say, often use quick cuts, right? Because it's easier for doing some of the, we're using a stunt double, so you cut away so you can't see that it's not the actual actor. It creates more of a sense of action to it, and just in general. And it's meant to, so it accelerates the rhythm, accelerates the pace of the film. So right, it creates that sense of a more action-based sequence. Now, you know, and that one was meant to be intense, a little bit, you know, what's going to happen, but it also showing, in this case, like I said, what's going on with the guy he comes across versus what Indiana Jones is doing at the same time. And all of that plays into that kind of, again, more upbeat, fast-paced. It's a more happier, chipper kind of cut. You know, it's not often that you see that the more serious, sad, somber stuff done in the quick cuts, because it just creates completely different emotion and feeling with that connection. Now, another example of that is with Jojo Rabbit. Let me put up here. In the very first opening scene, that just at the beginning. This one you can actually also call a jump cut, because now the jump cut, its meaning has changed over time, and we're going to talk about that. This is a light jump cut in the more modern sense of how the word jump cut is used. And we'll come back, maybe we'll look at this again with a jump cut when we talk about that next, when we get to jump cuts. But let's look at it just in terms of quick cuts, and like, what does this kind of create here? So here's this one.
Jojo, let's stop.
Oops. I'll go back and save it right there. Okay, so that's it, right? That very first scene. And there's several in the film. That's just one of them. But right, so one is it is a jump cut in terms of, like I said, the more modern meaning. Even if it's a small jump cut, because it's going from, we don't see him do the whole dressing. You're seeing pieces, and then it's jumping to the next piece of the uniform. But it's also quick cuts, because each one of those is a very, very short, quick, rapid cut, right? And it's meant to be this idea of getting dressed efficiently, quickly, the movement of straightening up your shirt, and that quick cut sequence is meant to be the sharp, snappy, right, like feel with it, that he's proud that he's wearing this, that he's putting it on, that it's done in this quick, efficient kind of fashion, or at least knowledgeable fashion, of he's not fumbling with it in these cuts. And so it's meant to suggest of, like I said, someone who is confident, someone who, even though he's not, right, we find that out very quickly, he's not confident, but those are usually associated with that of someone who's assessing themselves, who feels confident, who's getting ready, and it's meant to be this kind of, immediately right into it, kind of upbeat thing, and then immediately jumps to him then being not confident in that situation. So there's that juxtaposition between what at first appears to what he actually is. And that's that editing of creating that. But it's also this very kind of fun, quick cut scene within that. So we'll come back to it when we talk about jump cuts in a minute with that as well. All right, now so that's the quick cuts, I think. Oh, here we go. This one also. They basically edited a scene from Rocky, and showing how you can. One of the things that you can do with a quick cut versus a long cut, which this is a little bit different in terms of spacing, because they have less. Like, technically, if you did these really fast, where it's mentioned as long, and he went through each one really fast, it would still show that he's in multiple different places. This would also be somewhat of a jump cut too. But the idea of what they're saying here is, if you do a quick cut in terms of he starts the workout and finishes it, it implies that it's an easy workout, versus if he keeps showing in more of a montage, place to place to place, it suggests it's longer. However, you could also argue that even in this longer one, as it's listed, if this is done in a quick cut where it's not, the shots are super short, it also creates a sense that, like, wait, how long was he actually working out? It seems very quick. If you want to showcase, like, working out and it having been this long, arduous thing, you're going to create long. Now, it doesn't have to be long, like a minute for each cut, but you would create a longer cut to show that he's actually working out and training for a long time. Versus if you did it, so it doesn't have to be just in the quick in terms of, like, there's only 2 cuts, but rather how long are the cuts. And if both of these were short, right, even this one that's listed as long would actually feel like he didn't put a lot of time into it. But if you make each cut here longer than what the average cut is, then it's going to feel like he's actually, the time, is putting in a lot of time within that, versus if you did it with, like, rapid succession and stuff like that. So I think that's like how this one's portrayed. I wanted to emphasize that. It's like, well, it can be length, where you just have a quick cut from one scene to the next that's short, and that's going to imply a length of time. But also, if in the long one they're short cuts, it's going to not actually make it seem like it took a long time to train and that it was hard. It would actually probably make you question how long he actually was training for. But if you have all of these and they're long shots, then it is going to create a sense of it being hard. So that's I think what you could compare if you took this out and just compared these 4 here together and said, let's do it in quick cuts versus long cuts. That even that, where you have the exact same footage, but or at least cuts, because obviously it'd be shorter footage for the quick cuts and stuff. But if you had the exact 4 sequences that you're doing in quick cut versus long, you're going to actually imply a difference in the training regimen, if you will. with that. The next thing we're going to look at is actually passage of time and elliptical editing and montage sequencing. So let's see, what are we on here? 4. Okay. So we can talk about, passage of time, elliptical editing and montage. Okay, so for these, we're looking at one of the things with passage of time is that you can use editing to imply a series of events, which this also goes into elliptical editing and stuff too, and montage. Actually, all of these do this. Elliptical and montage all can highlight events taking place over a period of time and passage of time. So, one of the purposes of editing is to have these transitions show from time to time, place to place, action to action, or character to character. The idea that you're having these transitions take place and that we can understand what is happening within those transitions, right? Editing allows filmmakers to have this visual shorthand of this, like equivalent of like writing of like meanwhile, elsewhere, in another place and time kind of thing. Is it allows you to transition. So it's in, we could put this the idea of that transition, right, can express shifting from time to, here we'll do it like this, right, time to, we'll just say time, because I'm just going to repeat it otherwise. So time to time, place to place, character to character, and action to action, right? And it can provide that. It also can essentially be the use of the same thing as what we mentioned with storytelling, phrases of meanwhile or elsewhere or and then or later too. So, but we'll just put a couple of those examples. The other way you can do passage of time and or that creates that transition, right, is, for example, cutting from daylight to dark. That's going to basically, that's all we need to know that it went from daytime to nighttime, or that a day has passed. So cutting from daylight to dark provides the suggestion that time has passed, or that the day has passed. And this isn't the only way to do it. We're going to look at a couple of different examples here. All right, another way for this, besides, so the idea with this, right, cutting from daylight to dark provides that suggestion that time has passed, but it also goes into other things that can tell us of passage of time, such as any type of sequence where you see the changing of seasons, right? And that can be shown with like the changing of the weather. The changing of leaves on trees is going to indicate that time has passed. There's a more simple way of showing pages on a calendar changing, flipping through. One of the things that was popular for a while, showing pages on the calendar flipping or being torn off. That would be if a lot of months had passed and you wanted to showcase that many months had passed, is the calendar will do a quick flip through the months, or they'll tear off the days if it's a single, like a day calendar versus a month calendar. That you can do that to showcase the changing of time. A clock is an obvious way that does it, right? And the reason for this and why they do the passage of time in this way is because, of course, like a film only has so much time to showcase the story, so they can't show all this, plus it would be boring. And so instead you have these different methods to be able to showcase that passage of time. And I have an example of that here. Let's look. In this case, right, this is the movie where he gets trapped while hiking 127 hours. And this is when he's trapped, okay? And so you see there's a shot of the watch that tells us the day and the time, and that it's nighttime. It's 12:46 at night, I guess, or early morning, but what we would consider nighttime, really. And then it showcases, like, that it's dark, right? And although, you know, they had to give some light to it, but the idea of, like, you see the time, which then indicates when he goes to the next cut that he's working, trying to free himself. And then the cut goes to, and here's, you know, the arrow that shows it, to a scene of where he was hiking, and that you can see now that it is daytime or early morning because of the light outside of the cave. Because, of course, one of the issues and why they had to go outside of the cave of where he's trapped is because it kind of stays dark in that area. So they go outside of it, show that light has come, so clearly it's not 12:46 at night anymore. And then he cuts right back to him still working on his arm. And that shows that like, we can know that he has been, one, passage of time, that it has gone from late at night to early morning. And the other thing that this indicates to us is that he's been working that whole time trying to free himself in that process, because we haven't changed. Like, if it showed him cutting here to sleeping, then we wouldn't think, oh, he's been working this whole time. He was working and at some point fell asleep, right? And then wakes up and then gets started again, right? That would create a different sentiment with the passage of time. It would still showcase the passage of time, but you have two things going on here, right? One is to show the passage of time, but to showcase how much time where he's working to free himself specifically in that process. So that's and so this uses the clock and changing from night to day to indicate that transition. And one of the reasons they do the clock first and then the aerial shot is because otherwise they would have had to go out of the cave and show, or the crevice, and show that it was dark, go back in, then go back out, when it makes more sense to have two different shots that indicate the same thing. The clock indicates the same thing as the outside shot, that it's a different time of day. And this one is, the clock just provides more precise time, where we don't need to know the precise time in the morning. We know that a significant amount of time has passed from 12:46 at night to where it's now light outside. So that's that structure. Now, the next thing then is the elliptical editing, and looking at how this is showcasing, again, transitions, like all of these, the passage of time, to, we'll say, location or setting, right? The transition of time is or passage of time is a transition as well. And in elliptical editing, it's often showing it's meant to show the transition to a different kind of location or setting. Again, it allows the filmmaker to omit events to save time in the overall film time, because you can't show everything. So, but you still need to be able to, while, we'll say, still maintaining a cohesive story, because of course you could omit a lot of things and have it not remain cohesive. And the idea is, how do you move the story, move the plot along in a way that is going to manage the narrative time. So through cuts, right? And that's still going to remain cohesive in that aspect. So for example, one way of editing might be, we have a character starting her day, right? And so they want to showcase some of that without showing everything she does. And so you have the first thing, let's say she grabs her keys. Off the table, right? And then you have a cut. And then we see her in the driveway in her car, okay? And then you have a cut. And then in the next scene, we see her, she is exiting the elevator. And entering an office space, right? And then you have usually the cut from that. The point being, right, is that we don't need to see all of the events in between these, right? We don't need to see every action, right? That as long as the cuts are cohesive, it provides that understanding of what she did, right? So we know, like, if she grabs her keys in the morning, and often that even before that scene, there's one of like waking up and then maybe getting changed or grabbing a coffee and grabbing your keys, right? Well, we know by grabbing the keys and seeing her driving the car that she's driving to work. And she's leaving the house and driving to work. Then, if the next scene after her in the driveway of the car is exiting the elevator, we know that she drove to work, got out of her car, got into the elevator, rode the elevator up, and then we see her exiting the elevator and going into the office. And now we know where she is in the office, right? So it creates a logical sequence of events. Right, that cut out unnecessary parts that we don't need to understand what's going on. Now you have to make sure that you don't cut something that might seem logical because you know the whole story. Like let's say if you're a writer and you wrote the story, well, you are going to, you know the whole story. You know in your head, like what you're planning to do with that in that sense. Like, okay, I know all the aspects of the story of how and I've envisioned in my head that she's going to do these different things and get to the office and stuff, or I want to express how that she does that. Or let's say it was a bigger scene than that, where like, you know, that this traveling from, she gets a certain news that she has to go on this business trip, and then so she's going to be traveling to another country. But if, so sometimes what can happen, I usually in like larger films, this doesn't happen because it goes through so much editing and reviewing that it gets caught if it does. But every now and then you see this where within this editing of this series of events to showcase while omitting some stuff, they end up accidentally omitting something that you need to have those contextual clues to understand the story. And that's where it can be problematic. So let's say she... and you can still probably make this logical conclusion. But let's say she gets to the office and then it cuts. So let's say there was another cut, right? Where she's entering the office space, cut. Next scene, she is in France, right? And then cut. You see her in a hotel talking to the hotel front desk person in French, but we knew that she wasn't in France before. So like there was a huge scene left out. Now, if we take the time to think about it, the logical conclusion is, for some reason, we don't know why, she ended up in France, right? Okay, but like you need like something where like her work tells her she has to travel to France, and then you'd probably have her packing and getting on the plane, or boarding the plane. A lot of times on plane scenes, right, they show them boarding, and then and maybe taking off and then or landing, but they don't show the whole flight. Obviously, we make the conclusion if you've gotten on the plane, you're flying to a new location. But if you skip the plane altogether and you skip the scene explaining why she's going to France, then all of a sudden the viewer's like, wait, how did we get to France? Why did we get to France, right? And so you have to make sure when you're doing this type of editing that what you're omitting is makes sense to someone who doesn't know the story, because that's where that can easily be left out, that a person who knows the whole story, that sequence of events with the cuts makes sense, but someone who doesn't know the story, that may not be the case. So there has to be that review of the editor being aware of, does this sequence of events make sense to someone who doesn't actually know what's going on with the story and is only seeing it as it's happening, versus someone who does. Again, it doesn't happen too often in larger films. I think sometimes in indie films you see it more when there's less eyes on it. And especially if the editor is playing multiple roles with smaller films, more independent films, where like they are been intimately involved with writing and creating the story, that's when you're more likely to have that kind of logical slip, because to the person who knows the story it makes sense. To someone who doesn't, you need some additional contextual clues within it. Another way of editing is the montage, which is also, again, to showcase passage of time and the transition. So again, all of these are based on transition. It's basically meant to refer to a series of brief, we'll put it here, a series of brief shots that summarize a section of the story. One of the ways that this is done is like when we'll put example, you have a plan being developed, and so you hear the narrator or the characters, right, going over the plan. And then what you see within the different cuts are the characters enacting or prepping for those parts of the plan. So as you see, and it will often go back and forth, like, so it'll show the characters talking around, creating a plan, like Ocean's 11, where they're figuring out the plan of how they're going to rob something, and then the montage is showing the series of events of them following that plan, right? We don't need to see everything. You get these brief shots that showcase a collection of what that plan was and them enacting it out. And this is this is done with like both longer or shorter films. So films with a shorter story duration can still have montage sequences to quickly cover plot points that don't need full explanation. Because essentially what it allows is that it allows to quickly cover longer plot points. So instead of having a half hour showing all of those scenes, you show the sequence of events in a montage that shows them doing it, and it moves the story forward quite quickly, and allows the story to move forward faster. Right, and so it's very useful in that sense of being able to cover a large amount of space in a plot without it taking up too much time. All right, the next thing is alternates to cuts. And this one's not super long, but we've been talking about cuts this whole time because it is the main way that editing takes place in film. But there are other ways to show transitions. Right, the most common to show that transition from shot to shot, right, is the cut. And I'd say 90% of the time that's what's used. However, there are other things that filmmakers can do in order and show techniques to show this transition. So you can have, let's see, we'll call it other methods. Right, and one way you can do that is focus in and out, right? So it goes from blurry to focused or focused to blurry. You can have overlapping shots. So it starts to, essentially one shot starts to fade out and the other shot starts to overlap over it. You can also have a fade, and there's fade. Come on, move up here for me. There is there should be a fade in and fade out. So fade out is when it goes from slowly darkens and disappears the image, right? Then you can also have fade in, and in that case with a fade in, it slowly lightens and then appears. So just the opposite of fade out. You can also have dissolve, and oops, that should have been one there with that. And this one is where you have one shot gradually, and most of these are all gradually disappears, and another gradually appears. So this one isn't overlapping because the shots don't overlap, but it's just it's like a slow kind of fade. Then you have the iris, and in the iris, this is where the image contracts and expands within a small circle. I always think of this one with Looney Tunes, right? So when that's all, folks, and then the circle, like I think of Looney Tunes, the introduction, the circle starts small and Bugs Bunny shows up, and then it opens up into a big circle, and then at the end when it's that's all, folks, it closes the circle, right? And then you have the wipe, and this one is one image appears to be pushed aside by the other. I feel like this is not used, is pushed aside by the other. I feel like this isn't used much anymore in early film editing, and I think in any any student editing, you see the wipe. When people are learning to edit, the wipe is a popular one. It's not usually done too often in professional filmmaking. It has to be a very specific reason. Again, any of these alternates to the cut have to have a purpose to them, right? Like you don't just use them because, oh, let's do something different. It has to, it creates a scene. It creates, like, if it's fading in, like someone losing consciousness. And so everything starts to get darker around them. well, that fits with what's going on and actually works better than a cut because it provides almost this point of view from the character that they're slowly starting not to be able to see because they're passing out, right? They're losing consciousness. That's where a situation like an alternate to a cut would work really well. Here's a couple examples of, here's the montage. And this also goes in somewhat with parallel stories too. But this is and this one is showing a training sequence. So again, it's meant to showcase a long period of training in these particular frames. And so you see it going from, so this works both for the montage and parallel of what's going on because you have two different locations where training is taking place. But they do this, so like here's location 1, here's location 2, and it goes back and forth. So it starts with this one and then moves over to the alternate location and then goes back to the other location and then goes back to the other. So this isn't exactly parallel because it's not two events happening at the same time. It's meant to showcase though that like these both were happening, and so if you only had number 1, it could still look like they're training, but by having two different settings of training woven in together, it highlights again that idea of that the training is taking place over a long period in time. It isn't just and especially with the seasons, right? That there's snow here and not snow. I mean, they're inside for part of it, but you can see there's not snow out here and in the courtyard. So the idea of like that the training it wasn't quick, it wasn't simple, it took over a long period of time. That's what the montage can do. Here's alternate to cuts, right? So this is the dissolve where you see ET, and then it dissolves into from night to day and using this idea of kind of like a fog. Which is more natural than like, why is there a random dissolving image? Well, one of the ways is that our vision, right, it becomes as night rolls in and the fog comes in, and then the early morning the fog begins to dissipate. It's a natural phenomenon that then would fit with creating that alternate to a cut scene. So again, I think any alternates to cuts that you do see are either people that are not experienced with cuts and they're playing around with new editing toys, and especially, again, this reminds me still of the camcorder in the 1990s, early 2000s, where they had all of these easy things that you could automatically add into the while you were filming. So instead of trying to figure out the tape and like getting it on a computer and having the right system, they had these transitions that you could select that would automatically take place while you were filming. So you could create a quick transition on the camera itself without having to hook it up to the computer. And then these were just ones that were available, and whereas cutting from scene to scene was more difficult. So that's what a lot of these remind me of because they were used a ton in that time frame. But at the same time, besides for like, not as new and even my son with the iPhone, like he uses a lot of these because they're the effects that you can touch and click and drop in, and they're easy to do. Cutting requires more skill with editing and understanding how cutting works. Doing these alternates to cuts, you don't need to know that. You're just trying to show a transition, and this is what you understand. So that's that. Even today with digital, this is still something that I think you'll see with early like people who are experimenting with filmmaking that don't have a lot of experience are going to use less cuts and more of these alternates. And then the other way in a more professional filmmaking setting is going to be with when it has a specific purpose. Like I mentioned, I think a really good one is the passing out and having it where it's fading to black because it's a substitute essentially for suggesting that the eyes are closing or that even you're losing consciousness and you can't see. Right. And so that if it works within the natural context of the story, then it can be more impactful than just a cut to the person passed out on the floor. It's almost like we're experiencing that person in the act of passing out. So that's, I think, the difference in that. Okay, the next thing is the 180-degree rule. And this is for, this is meant to create a clear sense of basically spatial location, so that we don't get confused where people are as things are being cut. And specifically, it's done for, so when they're editing, cutting from camera angles, if you break the 180-degree rule, and we'll look at it here in just a second, people could end up looking like they're facing the opposite direction they were just a minute ago. And that would get really confusing, right? It's meant to create a clear sense of where people and things are in the story space. And so when cuts are made from different camera angles, the people don't move. People or things, I guess we should be consistent here. People and things don't jump directions, right? It really is essentially to prevent people from getting confused about where things are within space. And so essentially it's this idea of, if you have a whole circle space of a location, right? And you have the 180 degrees, and you have people on the line. I'll show a better image of it. And you have a camera, different camera angles, right? Here. These are all good. One here would be bad, right? If this is the principal side. I guess you do need to establish the principal shot. Because if the principal shot was on the other side, then the 180 would be here, right? So the 180 extends out, and it's everything from this direction. And all of this on the opposite side of that imaginary line is bad. And the reason for this is because, again, if your principal shot is here, let's say this is the principal shot. Okay, then if you go past this 180-degree line and you film over here where it's bad, they're going to switch. They're going to look like, one, you either see the back of their heads, right? Which then it's like, what, why? Like, we just completely rotated around, because the cameras put us as the viewer in that space. And so it would, if you were cutting from this camera here, so, oops, you can't really read that. Let's go camera 1, 2, 3, and we'll call this 4. If you cut from camera 1 to camera 3, and then to camera 4, or camera 1 to camera 4, right? All of a sudden, it can be jarring, because it now creates either the back of their heads when we were not in that. It indicates that we somehow got up, walked around to the other side, and moved to view this scene. And that just makes it confusing. Or if you move it around and then they turn and face the other way, then it looks like they're facing in a different direction. And you cut to it, though. So it's like this jarring cut of, wait, how do they get to a completely different place? You want to create a continuity of story and have it make sense from shot to shot. And so the principal shot, they also call it the master shot too. Right, but so the idea being is you have to have this continuity that takes place and how we absorb movement and a cohesiveness within that. And so by having essentially like these two characters stay within the half circle, It essentially maintains that consistency. And we don't get confused about, we always know then as they're cutting back and forth between the characters, like, okay, this person's on the left, this person's on the right. And when they cut to a close-up of like this person here, we know where he is in space, because the line hasn't moved and you haven't moved to the other side. Likewise, if it cuts back to this character, right? So they're going back and forth with cuts based on the camera angle, right? 3 to 2, 2 to 3. We aren't ever like, wait, where are they? How are they here? We know automatically, even though we don't see it, right? Because if it does a close-up to where it cuts into, actually, I guess camera 2 would be onto this character here. But like, if it goes a close-up to one of the character 1, right? And we don't see character 2. So we start with the master shot where we see both of them. And then it cuts to the other camera angle that only shows character 1. We still know where he is in the spatial realm of things. He's on the left-hand side. And then if we have a cut to character 2, we know that she's on the right side, because we haven't, that line hasn't been broken. And that's important because it can get super chaotic of trying to figure out what is going on if that line essentially is broken. So here is this one explains it. I'm not going to go over all of this and stuff that way, but here they do mention the one way that to break it is to intentionally disorient the audience. So if you want to mess with them, you break the 180 rule, and then yeah, it will totally screw with them, and then you'll be trying to figure out what's going on. So sometimes that is done, but it's rare, and it only should be done if it's intentional. If you're not trying to screw with the audience about like basically spatial location, then you really don't want to mess with that in that sense, because it just creates confusion and all of that. And then the other thing that that you have here is the 30-degree rule. And this is that the camera shouldn't move 30 degrees, that it should move like 30 degrees around the same subject to avoid a jump cut. So, and this is just, so here, we'll go back to here for a minute. D. 30-degree. I'll write it out like I did the other one. Rule. So basically, if you want to avoid a jump cut, keep the camera within 30 degrees between cuts. So if we go back and look at this and stuff, here, right? They're showing, so you have cameras placed within every 30 degrees. When it's the same subject, right? And it does mention that. If you're cutting from different camera angles with the same subject, you've got to keep it within that 30 degrees, or it's going to appear as a jump cut. So it's also a good rule for the jump cuts. If you want to create a jump cut, make sure that the camera is more than 30 degrees on the same subject. Here's another example of it, which is just showcasing how the angles are shown and some of the issues with that, right? So if here are the subjects, the camera 1, this is the view that you're going to see, camera 2, camera 3, and then if you go into the red zone, right, what do you notice about, right, this is the reversal of where the blue character appears to be. And that becomes part of the problem. All right, and here is the 30-degree rule, which is what I just explained, but it's just showcasing how it's going the angle of the camera to the person, and also again 0 to 90, what it looks like from 0, what it looks like to 90 degrees, so that this is going to be, if you go from 0 to 90, right, you're going to have it look like a jump cut, but the 30-degree angle creates a smoother transition. All right, the next thing is, and I know we're running long here, so I will try to do these quickly. 7 here, I think, was the eye line match. And then we have, so I'll do these ones pretty quick, and I'll just show, and then the jump cut. Okay, so eye line match. This is essentially where it's a kind of a clever cut to first show someone looking at something or someone. Okay, and then in the next cut, it shows, so we'll put a cut here, what that person is looking at. Oops. And so the idea being, by going from first showing us from their perspective. A weird flashing. Must be pressing down on something with my hand here. There we go. Okay, so the idea is, the goal is that it's showing the cut shows the line, like basically, no. All right. No, one note. Don't start this. We're so close to done. All right, hang on. Let me get one note back. All right, now I really need to hopefully get this before it starts acting up. So the cut is what it's meant to show is us following the eye line or gaze of the person. Right, it creates more of this, essentially moves to first person perspective. It can be used for tension, uncertainty, for emphasis on visual, right? All of these things, it can help take place. But out of all of that, right, it gives us access to the character's point of view, that first person point of view, briefly, right? Where we're getting to see as if we're seeing as the character sees, okay? And then the next thing is cross-cutting. Come on, one note. Don't do this to me right now. We're almost done. And parallel editing. With cross-cutting, so we'll do the first one here, cross-cutting. You have where 2 shots or scenes are cut back and forth. So that one with the montage where they're training, that's not parallel, but it's cross-cutting. And so what it does is it allows us to see 2 different locations or settings and events happening. And so what they did is they cross-cut to create a montage of that training sequence, because you had scene 1 and scene 2, right? And then for parallel, it's similar. You have 2 scenes that are taking place with this. And it's the idea of 2 Oops. Oh, no. Two events, or, oh, come on. I don't know why OneNote decided I think it's overheating. I've been filming too long. It's telling me to stop, but I only have one other thing after this to do. Two events or actions in two locations taking place at the same time. And so, right, that's the idea that they're both happening at the same time, but they're not. It's not the same person, right? In the training one, it's the same guy, so those things can't be happening at the same time. There's a really good example of this in the French Connection, in the original French Connection, and it's with Doyle in the car following the train above him. And so what is, I don't know, crazy but interesting with this one is that, and I was going to show the scene, but it's getting too long. So if you want to Google this one, you can, like French Connection, Doyle car chase, search it that way. But what you see is the train is literally above. Like here's the, that's my train apparently. Okay, right. So here's the train above, and it's above ground train tracks. And then he is here in the car. All right, so here's my quick car with a door that looks like a car, a weird door. Anyways, he's driving, and we keep seeing it cut to him looking up. And so there is the one scene is the car driving with the character Doyle. The second scene that's taking place is the train being the train with bad guys forcing the conductor to try to escape, right? And so what was clever about this scene is it actually is happening in parallel, an actual parallel action. It doesn't have to be. It can be just two scenes that are happening at the same time and that are taking place at the same time and are connected and related to each other. But in this case, it's physically parallel to each other. So that's what's clever about the French Connection one. It's physically parallel to each other, but you have two scenes that are happening at the exact same time. That's what parallel editing is, right? So the car chases, Doyle driving the car is chasing the train, and there's the whole scene with him swerving around, honking, slamming into stuff. I'm surprised in this scene that the car still drives at all. And then in the second scene, the second action is that what's going on in the train, which doesn't have it, like Doyle's not there. And so we're getting to see that what's happening at the train, that's happening at the exact same time as the car scene is happening. And then it's just, again, that added clever bonus of the actual physical parallel component to it. So with parallel editing and stuff, what it allows you to do, right, is that it gives you this, you get two stories at the same time that you see and how they're connected and what's going on with it. And it still maintains that continuity of events while also getting to know, like, that, hey, these two things are going on at the same time, right? And it's important to know that they're going on at the same time. Okay, and then I still show I do want to show one scene with a jump cut real quick. Jump cut is essentially, it's a jump in cuts of where basically the position or action appears to suddenly jump and is not seamless, right? And this is done by the cut. right? And this is, you're cutting it. And so it can look like a glitch, skip, or error. Sometimes the jump cuts were errors and stuff like that. It also, though, can create fast-paced movement. It can also create this idea of repetition. Right, so that it's like repeat over and over. So you're emphasizing that. It definitely emphasizes the action, and because it's abrupt, it calls attention to the cut and scene. Okay, so let's look at, I want to show you, I mentioned before, Jojo Rabbit is a light jump cut. So let's look at that again in that context. If it's going to play. Come on. Come on. Oh, no, it doesn't want to show it. You can just hear it. My computer's struggling. We're almost done. All right, let's try the other one real quick and see if this one will play. So this one is really great. This is big jump cuts. Jojo Rabbit's small jump cuts. This jump cut is much more obvious. Like, you won't miss it. So let's watch and see if hopefully this one will play.
And we haven't showed so much as a third.
Okay, so that's that one. It was a little delayed, but that's okay. You still got the idea because the jump cut is also pretty messed up like that. Here, I'm gonna go off of this because you saw the Jojo Rabbit one already, so we'll leave it at that. But the one where they're literally the how the characters were moving in that one wasn't because of the delay of my computer. Like, they clearly are showing them, like, well, they're standing up, and then the jump cut to the next cut, they're sitting down. They're in one side of the room, and then the next jump cut, they're in the other side of the room. It's a super clever way of exaggerated jump cut to showcase the idea of time passing and them being bored and it's slow, which he then mentions, right? 6 o'clock and no one's come into the store kind of thing, or come into the building. And they're sitting around waiting. They were expecting people to come in and no one's coming in. And so it shows that restlessness. It shows that they're, have been moving locations throughout the day without having to show them pacing or wandering. It's still creating that same one. It's a very clever use of jump cut, but it's also extreme, right? Because you have a character who's standing and literally in the next cut, with no transition to them showing them moving, they've gone from standing to sitting down on the opposite side of the room. And then the last things with the PowerPoint here, because again, I know I'm sorry it's so long. The eyeline match here, you can see in this sequence of events, the character where, like, right, a shot, a person is shown seeing off screen in one direction, and the next scene we see what she's seeing. So you see the character from this position, and then in this one it's interesting because then we see what she's looking at. So that's the eyeline match, 1 to 2. Then we see again her looking, but this time it's a close-up. This is the landscape, the fall of Icarus, where it appears that she's noticing Icarus here, which many people don't notice. That's the whole point of this painting, is that kind of life goes on and everything else around. No one even notices that Icarus has drowned, versus like a different painting with the fall of Icarus. He's front and center and everyone's watching him. But so, right, we see her, she seems to be noticing something, and then we see what the eyeline matches that she's looking at this painting. Then we see her with a new expression, looking maybe surprised a little bit, or at least certain emotion to the thing. And then it zooms in with the eyeline match on what specifically she's looking at in that painting. So we get from her point of view, and we know exactly what part of the painting that she's looking at. And this was just another example of showcasing that, of where is it that someone is looking. I'm going to skip to here, when we're talking about continuity and editing and the importance, I put this one in just because this was, and these are obvious things. We didn't talk about this too much, but like one of the things that is a continuity is props. So in this shot, the sandwich looks like this, and then in the next cut, the sandwich is actually less eaten. And that was just a mistake in timeline and them noticing that because they obviously shot this and then came back and shot this later, or the other way around, but then reversed it in editing. And when they're editing, the editor didn't notice that difference, and it actually then messes up the continuity of things. Parallel editing, right? This one was Star Wars. These two things are happening at the same time. And so it cuts back and forth between the two. One is with them in the Millennium Falcon, and the other is Luke Skywalker with on the fighter going in and they're communicating and witnessing and communicating, and it's going back and forth between that. And then I'll just show this last one here because again, time wise, this one is Groundhog Day. And this was a clever use of jump cut as well, because they're showcasing, right, Groundhog Day. He's experiencing the same thing over and over and over again. And one of those things is him getting slapped in the face. And so they jump cut with him wearing a slightly different place, a location. So like they're never exactly in the same angle or location, but every day he's getting slapped in the face. And so it tells us with each jump cut, it's a new day. And so it's like a quick rapid succession of slap, 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 slap. And we know from the jump cut that each one of those slaps is a different day, not like he keeps repeatedly getting slapped all in the same day. So it's a very clever use of jump cut as well. Okay, I'm way over on this one. We'll end it there. And we'll be looking at sound in the next one.